You know, back in February 2016, when the Republican primary field still was pretty crowded, John Nichols wrote an article for The Nation magazine headlined, "President Trump, It Could Happen." At the time, of course, the scenario seemed quite a stretch. Well, now we're living it, and John has taken the time in his new book, Horsemen of the Trumppocalypse. I was just talking to John about how tricky that word is, and I was determined not to trip over it. So anyway, in his new book, Horsemen of the Trumppocalypse, he's taken the time to sketch out several dozen of the top players in the Trump administration. In doing so, he draws on decades of political reporting experience. He's been a national correspondent for newspapers in Toledo and Pittsburgh, and currently writes not only for The Nation, but also for The Progressive and In These Times. He lives in Madison, Wisconsin, where he's an editor as well at the Capital Times. You may also have seen him on TV, where he frequently appears as a commentator, and he's authored 10 or co-authored 10 or 12 books. So you don't really sit still too much, do you, John? No. Now, lots of things about the Trump administration have proven to be, to say the least, rather unsettled so far. And indeed, in the time since John finished his new book in June, and its publication now, several of the senior advisors profiled in it have exited. Among them, Steve Bannon, Reince Priebus, Sean Spicer, and Sebastian Gorka. But many more who will surely have considerable influence over the Trump presidency remain in the cabinet or in other government offices, and John examines their connections and special interests and the impact they're likely to have. Needless to say, but I'll say it anyway, John is highly critical of and strongly opposed to Trump. He calls for an all-out resistance that identifies, quote, all the wrongdoers, all the collaborators and conspirators within and around the Trump presidency, and calls for holding them to account. And he intends his book as a step in that direction. So we should be in for some rather spirited discussion this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming John Nichols.
All right, people, say it with me. Trumpocalypse. See, now look how well they did. You know, I had no idea when I set out to write this book. And I, you know, like I'm not one of those serious people that puts a lot of effort into the writing. I think of the title first, right? And I had no idea when I set out to write this book that the title would be such a difficult thing. But I've done about 20 radio and TV interviews so far, and some of the smartest people in America have struggled with the term Trumpocalypse. I'm going to make it very simple for you. A Trumpocalypse is what happens if the people that Donald Trump empowers get to take things to the place where they would like to take things. And a Trumpocalypse is averted if A, we know who they are, which would require us to have a media that covered politics. I'm not sure, rather than personalities. Number one, we know who they are. And number two, we know how to resist what they seek to do. And that's the point of this book. And let me tell you, I know we're all supposed to be depressed and scared. Writing this book caused me to understand a couple of things. First off, anyone can be a member of a cabinet. I will guarantee you, if I took the first 5 rows, I'd have a better cabinet than Donald Trump has. And if I took some of the people in the back, it would really be great, because it's the late arrivers who are out there doing good works. And I just want to start out quickly by saying thank you to Politics and Prose, which is a wonderful independent bookstore that stands strong. It's gone through some of the downturns in the book industry, and now as people have come back to the book, back to the printed page, this store is a model for the whole country. And I just want to thank Brad and everybody for having me here. I want to thank C-SPAN, which is with us tonight and never gave up on the book. C-SPAN Book TV and all of the work they do really does open up this dialogue from the left and the right, brings everybody in. And I have to tell you, in this book, I learned, when I was analyzing some of these cabinet picks and that, you know what I'd do? I'd watch Morning Journal, and I'd listen to the calls on both sides, because it really gives you a perspective. You know where the power bases for many of these members of the Trump cabinet and his advisors and allies are. And many of them, I will tell you, are stronger than Trump. This is an important thing to understand. Many of them come with historic power bases rooted in their wealth, in their connections, in their long-term ideological journeys that make them people Donald Trump cannot fire. Let us all just say the name Jeff Sessions. No, everybody's like, oh, what's Donald Trump going to do? When's he going to get rid of Jeff Sessions? He isn't going to get rid of Jeff Sessions unless he's watching tonight and he's embarrassed by the fact that we reveal this. But the truth of the matter is that Jeff Sessions has a power base rooted in the South, but also rooted in people who are militantly anti-immigrant and people who have played the race card again and again in our politics. This is a small portion of our society, but it is a portion that was essential to Donald Trump's base, so essential that after the tragedy and the horror of Charlottesville, Donald Trump struggled to call out the people that any decent American president would have said have no place whatsoever in the deciding of our politics or what monuments we put up or how our communities are organized. And so Jeff Sessions will remain, but he won't remain for good reasons. I want to, as I mentioned, one other thing as we're introducing here. Someplace in the back is my dear friend Ben Wickler. There he is. And Ben, I'm always in the room with people who are more important than me, and which is essentially every one of you. But in this case, if you watched the fight over the health care bill, the heroes of the fight over the health care bill and over trying to get rid of what is called Obamacare, the heroes of that fight were people with disabilities who came from across this country and stayed for days, even weeks, sometimes slept in the streets. So they suffered great pain. It was incredibly difficult for them, and yet they came because it was a matter of life and death for them, and their resistance made it possible to prevent this administration and its allies in Congress from achieving one of their greatest goals. And a person who was out there, because he's one of the leading figures in MoveOn.org, who was out there every night with them and also with other people who had come across the country to assemble and petition for the redress of grievances, as our Constitution makes it clear that we can, was Ben Wickler. If you saw videos of the moment when it was announced that the Senate had rejected the legislation, had rejected what McConnell had put forward, you see this very young, handsome guy jumping up and down and punching the air and cheering, and that was Ben Wickler, who's right in the back of the room here. So, let me tell you about this book for a few minutes, and then we're going to take a lot of questions tonight because C-SPAN is here, and we love C-SPAN for a variety of reasons, but number one, it's your chance all to be on television. And as we know, if you're on television a little bit, you could be president of the United States. So let's begin, though, with why write this book? Because wouldn't it have been the right thing to do? Indeed, it was almost 2 years ago. I was covering Donald Trump as he campaigned for president. It became clear to me that for a variety of reasons in our politics as it has structured out, that there was a possibility that Donald Trump could become president of the United States. It was clear to me very early on that he would be the Republican nominee because he figured out the Republican Party, which isn't that hard. The Republican Party is a bunch of very rich people who exploit the fears of people who are not as rich as they are. And what Donald Trump did was come in the middle of them and say to the people who were fearful, who were in difficult situations, who were scared, sometimes who were really mean people, whatever, he said to them, those guys up there, the elites, they've been lying to you. Don't vote for their candidates. And the Republican base said, you bet, we're with you. We don't like them either. And so suddenly there was a rejection of the Republican Party's elites. And then Donald Trump turned around and he used a very similar strategy in running in November, which was to say to a broader grouping of Americans, look, don't trust the people that you have trusted up to this point. They've been lying to you. They've been letting you down. And that would get him a long way. Now, remember, just to point out here, he did lose. He got 46% of the vote, which is a better part, more than a point less than Mitt Romney got losing in 2012. He lost the popular vote of the country by almost 3 million votes. 54% of Americans didn't vote for Donald Trump to be president of the United States. If we lived in most countries on the planet, he'd be back with a TV show right now. And I think everyone would be happier, including Donald Trump. But because of the vulnerabilities in our system, he became president. One of the things that I realized as I was covering him during the 2016 campaign is that he's a great showman. He's fabulous at getting in front of a crowd of people and riling them up, because he does something that modern movies and modern television does, but most of our modern candidates don't realize you can do. And that is be a bad boy, right? Say something that's just a little bit risque, a little bit beyond what you're supposed to say. And people who have grown horribly bored with politics, who see politics as the most routinized, predictable thing around, saw, well, here's this guy who says things you're not supposed to say. And that was very, very appealing. He figured that out, and that got him through a long way. But the other thing that I recognized very early on is that Donald Trump knows nothing about governing. And I don't say that to be, this guy knows absolutely nothing about governing. And unlike Ben Wickler or a lot of other people, he hasn't spent his entire life thinking about what if he became president of the United States. The famous, the rock star Patti Smith said that when she became a rock star, when people wanted to interview her, she was ready because she had spent 20 years in front of the mirror interviewing herself, right? She had really thought, I'm going to be a rock star and I'm going to be ready for it. Donald Trump didn't do that. He didn't know people. He didn't have the connections. He didn't understand the process. He was manifestly unprepared to be president of the United States. And so what I knew from the very beginning was that when he became president of the United States, if that did happen, and I'm not going to tell you I predicted it, I said it could happen. And then I thought, no, come on, right? I was let down. But one thing I was absolutely certain of from the start was that Donald Trump would be defined not by what he did, but what the people he appointed to key positions did. That his presidency would not be about him, it would be about how he distributed the power of the presidency. And this is a very big deal, because everyone in this room says, no, you're not right, Mr. Nichols. Every single night, all that television ever does is show me every single thing that Donald Trump did that day. I have memorized every one of his tweets. I have watched every one of his, we see him verbatim 24/7. That's not governing. That's not running a country. That's The Apprentice. That's a TV show. And he's good at that, but he knows nothing about how to assemble a government. And so I was sure, even before the election, that the real story of this administration would be who this guy who knew nothing about doing it put into positions of power. And a brief segue here. The presidency wasn't always like this. Does anybody here know how many members of the cabinet George Washington had? Yes, sir. No, hey, we got a winner there. You were very good in the game, brother. But we have a winner who said 4 or 5. He's exactly right. It was 4 or 5, depending on how you count John Adams, the vice president. But we actually know we know the names of the members of George Washington's cabinet. They do plays on Broadway about them. Hamilton, right? Jefferson. These are big deal people we remember. Donald Trump, he struggled when they had Betsy DeVos at the White House, when he was announcing, he struggled to remember which job he was appointing her to. No, I'm not kidding. I mean, this guy, there's more government than he knows what to do with, and it has expanded to become so imperial, as Arthur Schlesinger Jr. suggested, that a president has the ability to put people in charge of huge aspects of our future: education, transportation, war and peace. These are definitional positions. And Donald Trump didn't have any idea who he was going to pick. Remember when he was like teasing Romney? Maybe I'll make you Secretary of State, maybe I won't. And, and he's like, he was bouncing. He was struggling because they literally had people coming in and presenting themselves to him to try and lobby for the position. That's not how it's supposed to work. You're supposed to come to a position of power with at least a few ideas about what you want to do and who you want to put into key positions. He didn't have that. And so he went in case after case with the loudest yeller. Now, that's an old Woody Guthrie term. Or Stetson Kennedy, actually. Stetson Kennedy was a singer and a writer down in Florida in the 1930s and 1940s, friend of Woody Guthrie. Guthrie popularized this term, loudest yeller. Stetson Kennedy said, I want to be the loudest yeller, right? I want to be the one people notice. Well, when the loudest yellers came in to meet with Donald Trump, he's like, yeah, hey, I like you. You make a lot of noise. And so who did he put in charge of education? Betsy DeVos. Betsy DeVos has been the loudest yeller against public education as we know it and as we would like it to be for the better part of 20 years. No one would ever have paid any attention to her whatsoever except for the fact that she's rich. And in America, if you're rich, you can be president of the United States or you can be Secretary of Education. But you're not that because you know anything about it. You're that because you buy your way into it. It was summed up. I write about all these things in the book. When Betsy DeVos came before the Senate committee that was constitutionally bound to analyze whether she was qualified to serve as Secretary of Education, literally to guide the future of our children. The best question that was, many good questions came through. Maggie Hassan from up in Vermont and other people, or up in New Hampshire, I apologize, asked terrific questions and really got to the heart of the fact that she didn't know about programs that were central to what the Department of Education does. She literally was ignorant about what were federal programs and what were state programs. It was a tragic, painful performance. Betsy DeVos made me feel sorry for her. And I never thought that was possible. But she got through most of it just in this tragic, stumbling way until Bernie Sanders came up. And Bernie Sanders, who actually understands issues of economics and class and wealth and poverty, he just looked at her for a long time and he said, Mr. Boss, I got a question for you. If you hadn't given $200 million, you and your family, $200 million to Republican candidates, including some of the people in this room here today who are going to decide your fate, if you hadn't given $200 million, do you think there's any chance that you'd be sitting here with this nomination? And to her immense credit, and I give her a lot of due for this, she didn't say, of course I would be. I know education top to bottom. I'm totally qualified for this. She said, well, it's possible. And I mean, like even she knew this was ridiculous. And the fact of the matter is that nominee after nominee after nominee for key positions, and also people who never had to go through the confirmation process, but took those positions in appointed posts, who were given immense power by Donald Trump, literally the power to decide the future of communications in this country, to decide whether we have net neutrality, to decide how our television networks operate and how they organize, to decide how Wall Street operates, to decide how it's regulated, to decide fundamental questions of how a military-industrial complex, what Dwight Eisenhower warned us about, would structure out in these times. And then you get to the fundamental questions of how we deal with technology and all sorts of other issues. The people he empowered were capable of impressing Donald Trump, a man who knew nothing about government and had thought very, very little about the future, but they were not ready to do the jobs they were given. And the fact of the matter is that if the United States Senate had done its job and gotten beyond silly partisanship and silly ideology and literally just done the job that the Constitution requires them to do, there is simply no question that they would have rejected Betsy DeVos. They would have said, you cannot have this job. You just can't. You should not be in this position. They would have rejected Scott Pruitt at the Environmental Protection Agency, because they would have said, when he stood up there and said, "Oh yeah, I'm kind of mixed on climate change. I'm working my way through on this," they would have known he was lying to them. Because the fact of the matter is, Scott Pruitt has been one of the central climate deniers of our age. He's a guy who regularly sues the Environmental Protection Agency. They would have rejected him because it was absurd to put him in that position. Because it doesn't matter whether you're a conservative or a liberal. It doesn't matter whether you're a Democrat or Republican. There should be a baseline of competence and a baseline of respect for the agency that you are in charge of. If you want to shut an agency down, if you want to dismantle it, then you should be elected to Congress and you should, or elected president, and you should work on dismantling it. But if you're given the responsibility for making sure that the water that our children drink is safe, if you're given the responsibility to making sure that we are prepared to deal with hurricanes which hit major cities and leave the fourth largest city in the United States underwater, then you better understand the current science on climate change, and you better be ready to establish climate resilient infrastructure so that you don't end up with more crises like the ones we're in. And Scott Pruitt wasn't prepared for this moment. He should not have been put in that position. I hope I make myself clear. Which brings me to Rex Tillerson. Now, Rex Tillerson is one of the most dangerous group I write about in the book are those who are referred to as adults in the room. You know, if any one of you is called an adult in the room, run screaming from that room, right? Because number one, it is said that you have been picked for a position by someone who cannot be trusted, given power by that person, and then you're supposed to keep them under control. With all due respect, I pick my daughter to do a lot of things, and I give her power to do a lot of things, and sometimes she's under control, right? But she doesn't control me as much as she would like. And the fact of the matter is that Donald Trump gave these people positions of immense power, but there's no adults in the room. It's an absurd construct. It is a fantasy that people have built up to try and make themselves feel good. Rex Tillerson was a corporate CEO of a fossil fuel company in an administration that doesn't take climate change seriously. That's not an adult in the room. That is an enabler for somebody who's wrong, telling them that they can be wrong and that they can do the wrong thing. That's not a healthy pick. That's not a team of rivals. That's not the best and the brightest. This is an administration of people who are there because Donald Trump thought that they were smart, that, you know, this is what a smart person sounds like to Donald Trump, but also because he wanted people he knew would do what he wanted them to do. Donald Trump's not the kind of guy who's saying, yeah, go out and run that thing, I'll come back and check with you in 6 months. And here's the tragedy of Rex Tillerson. He'll probably be the first one to go, the first big one to go. With all due respect, I mean, I know how exciting Sebastian Gorka is, but, you know, please, right? I'm talking about people with real power and ultimately people who are doing a lot of stuff that we aren't paying as much attention as we should to. Rex Tillerson will probably be the first one to go because he was put in charge of the Department of State, a historic department that has existed since the founding of the Republic. In the book, I talk about each of these agencies, each of these positions, how they developed, why they exist. The Department of State exists as a counterbalance to, again, what Eisenhower referred to as the military-industrial complex. You wanted to have somebody there who's saying, no, maybe we can talk our way out of this thing. Maybe we don't have to have a war. Maybe we can have diplomacy. Maybe we can have aid. Maybe we can relate to the rest of the world. Well, in this administration, Rex Tillerson is clearly not listened to. He is clearly not well regarded. And he has chosen to allow the Department of State to be diminished, dismantled, and undermined in ways that no Secretary of State in the history of the country has ever done. He is a horrible steward of an essential agency of our federal government. And you knew that from the committee hearing because he was asked when he was before the key committee where they were deciding whether he should be Secretary of State. They said, have you talked to Donald Trump about, like the Middle East? He said, well, we didn't get around to that. And we're like, have you talked to him about, this problem or that problem? We didn't get around to that. He acknowledged to the committee he had no idea. He had no idea how he would relate to Donald Trump as president of the United States. They should not have put him in this position. Now, if he had said, I'm going to oppose Trump, I'm going to put me in this position, I'll slow him down. I won't let him do some of this stuff. Well, then I would have said, yeah, go for it. But this guy wanted the job, but didn't have any idea of how he would do it. And he hasn't shown it since then. And so I have to be honest, in this book, I'm pretty unsparing with a lot of folks. I acknowledge when people are smart. Steve Bannon is very, very smart. He's probably the smartest man in the room. In fact, weirdly enough, in the Trump administration, Steve Bannon probably was the adult in the room. He reads extensively. He thinks about issues. He takes the title chief strategist because he really is a strategist. And I disagreed with him on fundamental issues, on a ton of issues, but he was a guy who actually thought about a lot of this stuff, wasn't just bouncing from moment to moment. He's out of the administration, but I suspect he's more influential now than he's ever been. Because one of the things is people say, well, Steve Bannon went out, so everything must be cool, right? Because Bannon, he was on the cover, and they had pictures of him saying he was the real president. Well, he wasn't the real president. He was there at Donald Trump's behest, remember? But the interesting thing is, Steve Bannon really is smart. He really is a strategist. Donald Trump went off the rails in Charlottesville, or in the aftermath of Charlottesville. He had a series of statements that showed him to be someone who should not be the president of the United States. This is not an ideological statement. This is not a partisan statement. This is simply saying, if you can't, after a bunch of neo-Nazis and fascists and supporters of the Confederacy get in a fight with people who don't like racism, you can't have a president who says, yeah, there's troubles on both sides. No, that's like the comic argument about, they used to always criticize CNN that said they'd had, people from both sides of an issue, right? And you say, well, what about the great moments in history, like the Civil War? Would you have somebody on both sides of slavery? Well, Donald Trump says yes. I mean, he literally says, yeah, I don't like fascists. I don't like Nazis. But, there's some very fine people marching with him. At that point, something big had to change. Something big had to happen. And so Steve Bannon stepped out. So ultimately did Sebastian Gorka. But don't think for a second that their ideas stepped out. The reason I profile them in the book and why I don't mind who comes and goes to some extent is because these are people that Donald Trump embraced. These are people that he took lessons from. And the truth of the matter is, Stephen Miller is still there. And if you think that Steve Bannon and Sebastian Gorka are scary, I invite you to go back and look at some videos of Stephen Miller. This guy has moved on the hard right since he was a young teenager. In the book, I write about his journey, and it's horrifying in many ways because it's such an example of someone who's gone way to the fringe on so many issues, who somehow has ended up in a position of power, helping to write Donald Trump's inaugural address, helping to do the Muslim ban, apparently giving advice as regards the Joe Arpaio pardon and things like that. Donald Trump has empowered people to do profound things. Many of them are doing them in our name without our informed consent as we speak. But he has also brought people around him who reinforce his worst instincts. And I'll close off and go to your questions with just this one counsel. If you like Donald Trump, I'm delighted you're here. And I'm delighted you joined us, and we'll have real dialogue, and I think that's superb, because in this country we ought to be able to do that. If you don't like Donald Trump, if you choose to resist Donald Trump, you must understand this. Donald Trump is a TV entertainer. If all you do is resist Donald Trump, then you are resisting a TV, you're like flipping the channel on TV. You must understand who he has put in positions of power. You must understand why they are there and what they will do with those positions. You have to expand your focus. If you don't do that, then it is very possible that people will say at some point, Donald Trump was a total failure as president. And then someone will write a revisionist book a couple years later and say, I don't know how much of a failure he was. He dialed down the struggle against climate change at a critical point. He prevented us from looking at the future of technology and the role that our changing economy will have in our lives because of changes in technology, because he just has no vision in this regard. He moved money out of social welfare programs and over to the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower and others warned us about. Donald Trump changed our country fundamentally. It's just that he didn't do it. The people he put in charge of cabinet agencies and regulatory agencies and all of these incredibly influential, incredibly powerful positions did it. And if we don't pay attention to what they are doing, then shame on us. Shame on us, because ultimately, Donald Trump cannot bring the Trumpocalypse. But the people he has empowered can bring a Trumpocalypse. And the Trumpocalypse, a word I can pronounce, the Trumpocalypse isn't all the scary bomb stuff that people think about. That's legitimate, and I don't dismiss people thinking about who's got their finger on what button. But the Trumpocalypse is a fundamental restructuring of the United States in ways that will make this country unfamiliar, not merely to us, but to our parents, would have made it unfamiliar to our parents, our grandparents, and everyone who ever fought for a country with liberty and justice for all. That's something that we need to avert. That's why we need to avert the Trumpocalypse. Thank you. Now, if I'm right, look at that. I was supposed to go 30 minutes, and you have 30 minutes for your brilliant questions. I like, and we do ask you to come to the mic if you can, because it's your best chance to be seen on television.
So in your book,
Yes.
do you talk about the Republican Senate
Yes.
that's enabled all of this?
Oh my! And we are not related. I did not put you up to this question, but I adore you for asking it. In fact, I profile about 40 people in this book. Many of them are cabinet secretaries. Many of them are White House hangers-on. Many of them are members of the Trump family who are sort of unidentifiable in their role and completely ineffectual, with all due respect to Ivanka Trump. But also, I look at the Congress a lot because I believe that Paul Ryan did more to make Donald Trump president than anyone else, including Donald Trump. Because everybody says, oh, well, Paul Ryan, he doesn't really like Donald Trump. He objects now and again. Every time that Paul Ryan objects to Donald Trump, he says, well, I wouldn't have said it that way, which, by the way, is a horrible thought, right? You know, his objection is that Trump doesn't spin things well enough. But then he would always say, but if he's the nominee of our party, I will back him. And so it is Paul Ryan who expanded the definition of Republican to include Donald Trump. And so understand, he's the core of making Trump president. But the core of making Trump's presidency successful, without a doubt, unquestionably, is Mitch McConnell. And I will tell you that Donald Trump is a very ungracious man. Admittedly, he did appoint McConnell's, wife Secretary of Transportation. That's sort of nice. But I mean, he's kind of picking on Mitch now. And I will tell you, nobody moved heaven and earth in the way that Mitch McConnell did for this guy. And I am ashamed of our United States Senate. I'm genuinely ashamed of it. Because I'll give you one quick thing I recount in the book. Just days before Scott Pruitt was named secretary or named administrator of the department or of the Environmental Protection Agency, put in charge of a very important aspect of our government. Just days before he got that job, a judge in Oklahoma ordered the release of documents from his tenure as Attorney General, which had been sought by public interest groups for months, in some cases years, that revealed his interactions with, his ties to the fossil fuel companies that, as head of the EPA, he was supposed to rein in and oversee and control. This is incredibly important information to the process. Jeff Merkley from Oregon, Sheldon Whitehouse, other U.S. senators went to the floor of the U.S. Senate and said, can we just wait until these documents are actually released? The order had come down. They were literally going to be released within days. And Mitch McConnell went to the floor of the Senate and enforced discipline and forced that nomination through. knowing that if they had waited just a few more days, even Republicans could not have voted for this guy. It was atrocious governance and a shameful disregard for his oath of office, his responsibilities in what's supposed to be shared governance. And I don't even have to tell you what he said to Elizabeth Warren when she raised essential, fundamental issues about the nomination of Jeff Sessions. And I will tell you this, though, before we let the next person ask a question. In my chapter on Jeff Sessions, I do find it unimaginable that he's the Attorney General of the United States. I open the chapter with just a line that kind of sums up the whole chapter. What can be said about Attorney General Jeff Sessions that hasn't already been said by Dr. David Duke?
John, first, thanks for your very kind words.
This is Ben Wickler. I've known him since he was 12. Yeah, and he has he has exceeded expectations.
Well, thanks for all your friendship and mentorship since I was a young teenager. Hopefully, not like Stephen Miller.
About the same age, though.
About the same age.
Yeah.
In the healthcare fight, we could pressure Congress, and members of Congress are accountable to their constituents. It's more difficult with cabinet agencies because they're not directly elected. And I'm thinking right now about like net neutrality. Today's the end of a critical comment period. Who knows what's going to happen with those comments? What can we do as citizens and as Americans to try to fight against and resist what these cabinet appointees and other Trump appointees are doing?
That's a terrific question. And one of the things I do in the book is I was on a radio show with a wonderful woman. She had read the book, which makes her different than a lot of radio interviewers. And she said, I read your book over the weekend, and it made me dramatically more depressed. And I said, well, you didn't get the point. The point is to empower you to deal with these things. And so the first step of empowerment is to know who these people are. George Washington could name all the members of his cabinet. It wasn't hard. Donald Trump struggles with it. We've seen video of him struggling to remember who's where. And most citizens, because our media is so presidential focused, so personality focused, they don't begin to see what happens in cabinet agencies and also in regulatory agencies like the FCC. This is a big deal, too, because it's also about the change in our media. Historically, in the United States, we had daily newspapers around the country that had Washington bureaus. Tremendous number of those bureaus have closed as the newspaper industry has contracted. It used to be that the reporters from the Des Moines Register kept watch on the Department of Agriculture. The reporters from the Detroit Free Press and the Detroit News kept watch on the Department of Labor. You had people from around the country who brought specialized interests to Washington and kind of kept reporting, and then that was an early warning system. We've lost a lot of that. And so one of the things I do in the book is highlight those who are doing good reporting, encourage people to follow, those who do look at all these different agencies and all these different positions, and also the activist groups that are watchdogging and they're serious about it, as well as the members of Congress who are doing so. And I want to pay tribute here. I'll tell you something. Sebastian Gorka, who was the president's advisor on counterterrorism, although anybody who was an expert in counterterrorism had doubts about, where he really got his training, or at least what he knew. But Sebastian Gorka had an incredibly nefarious past, with ties to groups that in Eastern Europe that had, by the accounts of some people, fascist or neo-fascist history. And it was really a lot of dark stuff. And one of the reasons that Sebastian Gorka is out of the White House today, it isn't because members of Congress, by and large, did their job. It isn't because Donald Trump, got upset by it. He is out of there because of the newspaper, The Forward. The Forward is a Jewish-American newspaper, over 100 years old, in New York City. And when they saw Sebastian Gorka wearing medals at an event that were historic medals from what they believed to be neo-fascist groupings in Eastern Europe, they put reporters on the ground in Eastern Europe to dig out the story, to talk to members of these groups, to really get to the bottom of it. That led Congressman Jerry Nadler and others to call for his removal and really created the situation that led to him exiting after Charlottesville. People need to understand this. If you don't know who these people are, if you don't know their history, if you don't know their background, you cannot possibly begin to hold them to account. So the first duty of this book is to help people to know who they are and to understand that. You can make your decisions about them once you're there. But then also, as I said, I spent a lot of time pointing people toward groups that are working on these issues. And I do say one other thing as well. This morning I spent some time with Ralph Nader, who had read the book and was very generous about it. And Ralph Nader, who's always monitored these cabinet agencies, points out correctly that impeachment isn't just for presidents anymore. The impeachment power exists for presidents, vice presidents, and those they empower. And so you can hold these people to account. And I'm not saying, wholesale go for impeachment. What I am saying is, if there are people who have lied to the Congress, if there are people who have fundamentally failed in their duties, use that tool to hold them account. Censure, impeachment, all the possible tools. And don't just focus all that energy on Donald Trump. Spread it around. Because there are people who, I say this quite often. In any room in this administration that Donald Trump walks into, he is not the most scary person.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Hey.
As troublesome as Trump is on so many levels, shouldn't we also be looking deeply at the deep flaws within the Democratic Party which enabled Trump in the first place and which will enable more Trumps to arise in the future?
You are a very wise questioner. Again, not related to me, but I'm glad you're here. Look, I mean, with all due respect, any statement on this begins with the line, they lost to Donald Trump. That's not good. That's not a healthy thing, because this is a guy who did not present particularly well by the most measures. Here's what I would say. The Democratic Party has people in it who have mounted really bold and impressive objections. I think Elizabeth Warren has done incredible job. I think Al Franken has risen to the level of being a member of the Senate. And I will mention the name of someone else who I write about a lot in the book, Kirsten Gillibrand from New York State. She voted against more Trump cabinet picks and nominees than any other member of the Senate. And she did so because she was not afraid to stand in defense of civilian control of the military. And so many of these people voted for these generals who've been nominated for these positions. And Senator Gillibrand said, hold it. The whole point of this thing is that we're supposed to have civilians in key positions as regards the military, because Eisenhower was right. A military-industrial complex is a scary thing. Many Democrats failed in that regard. There's no question. The Democratic Party is in desperate, desperate need of a reformation. And I say that in the religious sense, a genuine reformation. But I will extend from your question, if I can, to one other thing. I believe Donald Trump's presidency, this is about the most hopeful thing about Donald Trump's presidency and all these people he's empowered and all this stuff. I think he is a warning sign of the vulnerabilities in our democracy. And one of the vulnerabilities is the existence of an electoral college that allows the loser of the popular vote to become president. That is absurd. But another of the vulnerabilities is what we've allowed the cabinet system and the federal government to become. It is so big, and these cabinet agencies are so powerful. When I was writing the book, looking at their budgets, looking at what they control, it's astounding. And we've created a situation where it is very easy for people who should never be in charge of so much of our governance to take those positions. So it's a political vulnerability. I agree with you. But it is also a structural vulnerability that we really have to revisit because, with all due respect, our Secretary of Energy, the guy who's in charge of taking care of nuclear waste, is a guy who wanted to eliminate the department but couldn't remember that. Rick Perry, I'm sorry, you could not, if we were doing a Broadway play, we could not make this up. It would be too absurd. So the vulnerabilities in the system are, Democratic Party has got to change. It is vulnerable. And if they don't change, they run the risk of more Trumps. You are right, maybe a Trump who's a little better presented. But also, we have fundamental structural flaws that Trump is helping us to see and that his appointees are helping us to see. Again, though we will not address those structural flaws unless we see this as about more than one man, more than just a president and a personality. And I have a lot of objections to how media covers this administration because it's largely about this one man. Unless we, the people, can get beyond that, we run the risk of replacing Trump with someone who's a little better. And a little better isn't going to get us, isn't going to fix the damage that is done over the next few years.
How do you get beyond that in terms of the traditional party framework.
Yeah, it's very, very hard. And I will answer your question by saying there's a lot of people behind you, so I want to, no, you don't have, I'm not pushing you away, but I'm telling you that as we speak, and my friend Colin Robinson will be thrilled by this, I am working on a book on the future of the Democratic Party. It'll be my next book. And I'm pretty scathing in this book about the Trump administration. I will not spare the Democratic Party. I think the Democratic Party has some wonderful history and some wonderful people in it, but it has to become a smart party. You counter lies and stupidity and fantasy with facts and intelligence and courage and conviction. And the Democratic Party has to show a lot more of that if they're going to begin to challenge not just Trump, but a process that gave us Donald Trump. Whoever's next, but yes. Hi there. Get to that mic. I know it's yeah.
Excuse me, sir.
Do your best.
Thank you. That's exactly what I believe Mr. Trump is doing right now in a state where their Senate legislator wanted him to be assassinated. This is an uncouth public. I have been repugnantly upset. I think that the courage, if you ever have greatness thrust on you, you're certainly verbal and can manage the end of representing your ideas well, but he has, with courage and stamina and family presence, put himself at risk. The reason I think this happened is because we allowed a debt structure in 2015, before he announced his intention to run for office, by the very excellent bases of index of the OS and OECD, our international debt to be 22.5 trillion. Mr. Trump did go ahead. He ran, and in the course mid-race, had himself to borrow $50 million. Our failure, once before we, from finance, allowed a world to have credit available, we would not have had radical end to poverty, nor a trillion, then a zillion times computing ability possible in a short period of time, were it not for this form of money being made possible for the common man. And one is also security.
I will tell you something. It is not easy to stand up in a room where maybe perhaps a lot of the people disagree with you. And I will also say that, what she is trying to say, and what I think, I won't speak for her per se, but one of the things she's trying to do is say there are things that many Americans find in Donald Trump's tenure they agree with. That's okay. That's all right. What I am saying is, to those who do disagree with this presidency, those who do object to how it's operating, that you have a duty to be as courageous as she was when she just stood up in this setting and offered her views. Because the fact of the matter is, as long as we're talking to each other, as long as we're debating and stuff, we're going to get through this thing. Donald Trump is a blip in the history of this country. I promise you, he's a transition point. What I'm concerned about is whether he is a transition point to something dramatically better, a ricochet out of it, or is he a transition point to a politics where we will have variations on Donald Trump from here on out? That's what we will decide. And with all due respect to my friend, I believe that we don't want more Donald Trumps. And I also am not satisfied with our Senate, but I respect her for asking that question. My friend.
Hi, John. Let me just say, on behalf of all the people who are not in line to ask questions, I think there is one thing that we can all agree with her on, and that is the fact that the tweeting that we've seen since this presidency started has in fact been horribly Democratic, with the emphasis on horribly.
Well, can I address that for 1 sec? Many people say to me, look, we should not follow Donald Trump's tweets anymore. We shouldn't have him on TV all the time or things like that. I strongly disagree. This is an incredibly powerful person. We should watch what he does. We should listen to what he does. If you agree, that's fine. If you disagree, you should make it known. All I'm saying is that's not enough. It's not enough to simply pay attention to the man's tweets or his press conferences or his rallies. It is vital to see what Scott Pruitt is doing. It is vital to see what Elaine Chao is doing. It's vital to understand that barely a week ago, at that horrible press conference where Donald Trump went off the rails on Charlottesville, he was announcing changes to our federal regulations, our approach to these things, in which he was gutting Barack Obama's executive order from 2015 to make sure that U.S. spending on infrastructure took in the concerns about climate change and storm surges and flooding. And that Obama order was titled the Federal Flood Risk Management Standard. And Elaine Chao and Donald Trump overturned that barely 2 weeks ago, and most Americans didn't even know it. Now, it didn't affect Houston. This is for the future. But let me warn you that what they did was to say we refuse to learn from what is happening to this country. That is shameful, and you can't let that occur in the dark without people knowing about it. So I want to pay every attention to Trump, but I also want to pay every attention to everybody else. Makes us work a little harder. Stay up later. What's your question, sir?
So this regulatory capture piece that you're talking about is huge. I mean, clearly these are the people who will enable all that invisible change. But they in turn are kind of being enabled too, and you mentioned Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan, by a very compliant Congress. And part of why they get such a compliant Congress is the gerrymandering and the suppression that's going on. So, knowing your Wisconsin background, I'm wondering if you can talk about, for example, the Wisconsin Supreme Court case on redistricting and maybe some of the other institutional
factors. It's a great
factors
question. You've laid a lot on the table.
That overlay that.
I will do it very quickly.
Yeah.
Only because there's a wonderful group of people behind you in line there. And so all I will say is I'm not going to go into the Wisconsin thing. I'll just say look it up. We follow what's happening in Wisconsin on the issue of gerrymandering. We could see the United States Supreme Court finally address one of the core democracy issues in this country, which is the fact that most of our congressional races are non-competitive. I will only focus on one thing, a person that I write about a lot in the book, and that is Chris Kobach. He is the guy that the president has empowered to essentially be giving advice and counsel on voting rights, election issues, and a host of matters. All these things that you're raising. And the fact of the matter is that I've covered this Kobach character for years. Going back to when he was working with the American Legislative Exchange Council and other groups on a host of what can only be, in my view, called voter suppression initiatives. And he is the worst possible person to have in charge of this stuff. And we ought to, I genuinely say, that we ought to be on top of what he's doing every day, and we ought to be ready to resist it, because the answer to the question of could Donald Trump get reelected is not merely about his policies, and it is not merely about economic issues that are always in play. It is also about the quality of our democracy. How healthy is our democracy? And I fear that the people he has put in charge of overseeing and giving advice about how we should organize our elections are some of the worst players and some of the most disrespectful players as regards democracy in this country. And so that's why I write about Kobach, but it's also why I think we have to pay a lot of attention to him. Thank you for your good question. My friend.
We have 3 minutes, and it looks like 3 more questions.
Could we take quick, if people can be quick, I'll take a question from each and then try and...
comments I'd like your thoughts about. First of all, clarification. There's
Please.
just as many millionaire Democrats as there are Republicans.
Without a doubt.
So I think if and you're in a great place by being a journalist and author and all, is I think until we get out of this simplistic mindset of it, fix the Democrats and fix the Republicans, the root of the issue will not be addressed.
What do you think's the root?
That I think it goes back to the Declaration of Independence, where we really never did overthrow the king.
Boy, you are so right.
I think the analogy is
I
we
love what you're
just
saying.
changed it to have the subservient role towards the corporate entity.
Let me shake your hand.
I'd rather not hide cameras, but
No, I'm sorry, but boy, let me cut you off there only because we got no time.
yeah, okay.
I apologize, and let me quickly say, this woman got to the heart of the matter. And if you go back, and I write a lot about this in the book, when they established the system of checks and balances, when they established separation of powers, Congress was really powerful. In fact, The president doesn't have the ability to impeach the Congress. The Congress has the ability to impeach the president. This is big deal stuff. We have thrown things so out of whack. We have created such an imperial presidency in this country that it has created tremendous dysfunction. And one of the reasons I wrote this book is to get people thinking about whether they want a presidency that is as powerful as this one is. Sir, I think you got it. We're down to the seconds here.
I'll keep it simple.
And if you do as good as her, I mean, we're out of the park,
I
mister.
can't reach that.
All right.
Where did Kellyanne Conway come from?
Ah, what a
Who the
nice
hell is
yes,
she?
yes. My friend Liz Winstead, who's a comedian, was at the Minnesota State Fair, and she tweeted apparently they had a Kellyanne Conway scarecrow in the scarecrow contest, where they had her inaugural thing, and it was. I don't know if that was respectful or disrespectful. I'm not sure where it was coming from, but Kellyanne Conway is a good place to circle this around. I'm glad to answer other people's questions as we go along as well. We'll stick around and sign some books and do that, and I'm so appreciative of all you being here. But the answer to that question is a really interesting one. I start the book with Robert and Rebecca Mercer, who are major campaign donors, and interestingly enough, yeah, there you go. Interestingly enough, Robert and Rebecca Mercer had two people that they really put a lot of resources into and gave a lot of support to before the 2016 campaign. One of them was Kellyanne Conway, who was pollster and a person who ran a super PAC and did all sorts of things, very close to the Mercers, who are incredibly right-wing tech billionaires. And the other was Steve Bannon. And amazingly enough, after Donald Trump got the Republican nomination and these very wealthy people moved into position, who ended up running the Trump campaign? And I will just simply tell you that Kellyanne Conway is still in the White House. She is still very, very influential. And she and Ivanka Trump, in my view, played an incredibly significant role in the campaign, one that we should not forget. And that is when things came out about Donald Trump that made, I think, virtually everyone gasp. The revelations about what he said on the bus and some of this stuff. It was Kellyanne Conway who, more than anyone else, stepped up and really stood by him and defended him after that key debate. And I think she played a very, very critical role in making him president of the United States, more than is noted. She's now doesn't seem to have a lot of influence in the White House. But one thing I will tell you about Donald Trump, and it's why if somebody quits or comes or goes, don't take it all that seriously. Donald Trump constantly recirculates people. He brings people back into power. People who you thought were gone return. I don't even rule out that Scaramucci could come back. And I will tell you that in some ways I miss the mooch. But brothers and sisters, you have been an absolutely tremendous audience. I think you have acquitted yourselves well. Don't forget that Labor Day is coming up, and I really believe in renewing the tradition of the Labor Day gift. And I just happen to think that Horsemen of the Trumpocalypse makes a fine Labor Day gift. Thank you for being here. Solidarity.